Very warm welcome to the first panel, Placemaking in the Arts, the Art of Placemaking at this year's Placemaking Forum Mannheim. My name is Matthias Rauch. I'm the head of cultural innovation and creative economy at Next Mannheim, and I will be your host for this session. Today, we would like to talk about the relationship of the arts and placemaking efforts, and why do placemaking with and through culture and the arts? What are the challenges and opportunities when using art and culture for placemaking projects? Before we go into the discussion, we will have a short keynote by Dr. Kara Courage, and then we're going to directly enter the discussion. I'm going to introduce all the speakers to you, of course. I would like to encourage you, if you have questions, please, post your question in the Q&A section or directly in the chat, and I'll do my best to integrate all the questions that you might have and direct them towards the speakers. I'm very honored to welcome our keynote speaker for today's session, Dr. Kara Courage. She's a placemaking and arts activism and museums academic and practitioner and head of TED Exchange. TED's platform dedicated to socially engaged museums, socially engaged art and community, and museum setting and arts and urban design, placemaking, planning, and has published widely on these topics. Kara is author of Arts in Place, The Arts, the Urban and Social Practice, published by Routledge in 2017, and the co-editor of Creative Placemaking and Beyond, Routledge, also published by Routledge in 2018, and editor of the Routledge Handbook of Placemaking, published in 2020. A very warm welcome. I'm very glad that you could make it, Kara Courage. The digital floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Matthias, and thank you also for listening to me in English today. I can speak German. I used to get to the point I was dreaming in German, but my placemaking vocab is not up to it. So thank you for that. Give me one moment to share my screen with you, the usual delay to proceedings, but we'll start. So thank you so much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we will go on to have. Just trying to get the slides to go forward. There we go, right. A whistle-stop tour, I guess, on where I position myself in placemaking and various different components of placemaking. I was asked to consider a number of questions by Matthias for this talk, looking at the role and function of public space and public art post-COVID, through that time of the pandemic, looking at the pros and cons of a creative placemaking approach to place, challenges of working in the public realm. And I'm not going to necessarily answer those questions directly, but I'm going to take you through various different points to bring in around arts and placemaking and our post-2020 world that might help us all then collaboratively come to the conclusion on those questions. So I'm going to start by how I define placemaking myself. And for me, it's very much this is an approach, a set of tools that can put community front and centre of determining what their place looks like and how it functions. As soon as you take the community out of that, and very much out of that in that very agentive role, for me, then it's not placemaking. For me, then you're going into other urban design or public art planning disciplines. I anchor myself in a particular practice, social practice placemaking. This comes from the PhD research I did and observing a number of artists that would consider themselves socially engaged artists, working with a renewed or a sort of a deeper sense of place, and working with communities where they reside or where they gather. It's a specific mode of arts-based activity. It's a co-produced practice, and it's one that is concerned with process as much as it is any particular outcome. it demands working in a relative expertism. It's not one of a sole, singular author of an artist or an arts collective or a particular collaboration, but it demands that you, as the placemaker, as that artist placemaker, get out into the public realm, that you're hands-on with it, you're conversing with it, you're with the people of that place, and you're with them in questioning that place and interrogating that place. So the artist here might be an instigator of a project, they may not, but certainly there's a sort of catalysing around that artist, but working in an equal relative expertism with the community towards those shared outcomes and outputs. The picture that you see here is of an artist, Jordan Mackenzie. And I bring Jordan into this presentation because I think there's a specific kind of skill set that artists working in the public realm and in placemaking need to have. This is it's a conversation, it's a dialogue skill set. You need to be able to broker conversations between different stakeholders in different settings. And the art itself, the art process is this relational sort of turn, and I'll come to that a little bit more later. So Jordan is an artist that lives on a housing estate in the east of London. Here he is in Nine Elms area of London, which is one of the biggest developments in the whole of Europe at the moment. Slight slip of the tongue there, including Europe, UK and Europe, which makes me very sad. And what he was able to bring to this, though, even though he wasn't from that area, he had a really direct lived experience of an area, living in an area of social housing, going through social cleansing. And that, for him, that was a really core skill that he brought into that as an artist. Looking at creative placemaking, and there isn't necessarily one definition of placemaking itself. The definition that I gave you there is one that comes from my values and that inform my practice. But one kind of understanding of placemaking that's really taken hold is that of creative placemaking. And if you don't know it, here's a reminder of it now, created by Anne Markuson and Anne Gadwell back in 2010. This understands creative placemaking as something that marries a public and private. It uses the arts in regeneration. It has a fiscal benefit as well as social and cultural benefits to it. And this has really taken hold as an understanding of placemaking, but obviously namely creative placemaking, perhaps because there isn't a one definition for people to sort of to hook onto. And the intentionality, though, of this placemaking has been really critiqued since 2010, not least by the two authors of this, the white paper for the NEA, which is where this definition comes from. And I mention it here in that sense because it's critiqued along lines of, deep intersectionality, lines of financial access to culture, to place, along lines of race and power as well, were the two that that really have come up in that. And of course, it's a very US definition. It came from looking at a host of applications that were coming into the National Endowment of the Arts that were doing this kind of work, and asked, the two hands were asked to try and come to make sense of that, to see what was going on. So it has its limitations, and I think we have to question how much does it really stand true now. There's common tropes in that definition that probably we all may recognise in some shape or form, but we're in a different time and place now. So how much does that really stand true now? And I want to also take a moment to pause here for a word of caution. So just as you get with the terms green or eco, there's their overuse to the point of losing their real meaning. There's a similar thing happening with placemaking, and you see the term placemaking used for so many different types of projects with completely different stakeholders, completely different practices, and completely different intentionalities. And there is a danger of something which we're seeing place wash, of that term placemaking being used to put onto projects which perhaps don't, well, to my mind, don't come up to my own definition of placemaking. Placemaking is a really political act. The quote here, this is of a group of activists, resident activists in an area in London that were being socially cleansed, and there was vacant housing left, right and centre, but massive homelessness, and a number of single parent and young families being evicted and being asked to move all over London and all over the country, completely uprooted. A familiar story, unfortunately, across the world over. So there are some very urgent, vital conversations being held at the moment around the role of the artist, where that locus of power is in placemaking, where the agency in placemaking is, and of course on how we want our cities to be. And these were discussions that were really present in placemaking pre-2020, and of course are now being framed differently and much more urgently, actually, you know. So for me, to turn to the radical imperative of placemaking and keeping place wash in mind, keeping that definition that I hold of placemaking in mind as well, I want to circle back and come back to social practice placemaking and the role of art and artists in placemaking, and bring us closer to what I think is the radical imperative of placemaking, and sort of my offer out to this group as well as a point of discussion. I want to start by posing this question to you all, and it's one posed by the artist Francis Whitehead. I won't read all of these out, but I really recommend that you look this up. Just Google Francis Whitehead, what do artists know? As she rightly reminds us, beyond a wide range of material practices, histories and techniques, concepts and theoretical frameworks, artists are trained to use a unique set of skills, processes and methodologies. That is a list of those processes, methodologies that Frances identified through her own practice and that of others. And there's a huge amount there for an artist to bring to a placemaking table that is more than just an art practice as sort of notionally understood by some others. I also want to bring into this part of the talk Tania Bruguera and her work with Art Utile, which roughly translates as useful art. It was formulated by Tania with curators at the Queen's Museum in New York, Van Abbott in Eindhoven, and Grisdale Arts in the UK. And for a project to be considered an Art Utile project, it has to accord with these particular points here. And really the outcome of that is to propose new ways of thinking and doing. So it's very much a call to action. And when I first came across that, and I've had the pleasure and honour of working with Tania very deeply in my work at Tate, it really struck me as I'm looking at a placemaking here. And a lot of Tania's work is deeply, deeply concerned with place and with the cultural health of that place. I'm now going to turn to somebody that I have been a long admirer of, and this really for me is a central value for me, for my own practice of placemaking, but something, as I said earlier, that I think without this, you can't call it a placemaking project. And that's the artist Anna van Heesek, and her assertion that the community is the expert in their own lives. And I bring that here as well. So if you imagine around a placemaking table, there will be an architect, a planner, policymaker, somebody from, representation from the local council, the developer that may be involved, the artists that may be involved as well. And I count myself in that kind of professional bracket sat around that table. But what I bring to the table is a very specific set of skills. And I'm not the expert in being part of that community. I'm not the expert in knowing what it's like to live in that place and to know the really embodied, somatic experience, history of that place. And I don't know the aspirations of the people of that place. It's my job to find that out. But the community has to be there as an equal expert in placemaking. And I think that's also something which there's a very sort of that singular skill of the social practice artist can be really key in this, in really bringing those conversations to the fore and bringing those conversations out from the community, the position, and into that wider framework. With all of this, I've mentioned the word dialogues and sort of placemaking as a storytelling process, and so much of the placemaking work that I do is actually just out there and talking to people. So for me, placemaking is also something that's really radically relational when you compare it to some other practices or other working methodologies. And this for me is really one of the most important points in taking placemaking forward post-2020, is to really recognise the relationality of this. It's not just a transaction. It's not just to come in and make a material change to place and then off we go. There is a really deep relation and web of relations involved in placemaking. And I think keeping that relationality into it, it's also really keen to recognise, to keep remembering that placemaking is as much about the human as it is about any place. So this is something which, for me, it comes from Baudrillard's relational aesthetics. And of course that has that, and here's the nominal understanding of it now from Baudrillard. And of course this has been critiqued, and this theory has been extended by many others, and I would point you towards Grant Pester and dialogic aesthetics there, because it's a really, really good, extension of this. But I still find this a really good just reminder, as a stepping in point into that relationality of placemaking. This also, to me, speaks to the social practice that I work with. It's something, it is in place. It's social, co-created. Artist as the catalyst on something, but not the owner or author of that. And the artwork creates a social environment as much as created in a social environment as well. So turning now to what is this next this next era, this next epoch for placemaking, which is the last section here of what I'll talk about in this presentation today. Placemaking evolves through collaboration and gathering new constituents of practitioners and professionals along the way. And it is becoming increasingly cognizant of its political implications of working in place. And I feel for placemaking to be able to even proffer that it's an ally to citizens and to respond to time of crises, we have to have a really honest look at the past, the present, and of placemaking to determine what that future is. Placemaking does sit, or the way the placemaking term is used, it sits in a really uncomfortable position to regeneration and gentrification and social cleansing, and to the politics of power and access that are enacted through place. That definition of creative placemaking was written in 2010, so over 10 years ago now, and the next 10 years for us pose challenges for society that have massive place and placemaking implications. Placemaking alone can't change the systemic conditions that produce inequalities in place, but of course it has a really key responsibility to be involved in that change, if not even leading that change. We've got climate crisis, aging populations, poor mental health, transit, education. These are all things which are massive place implied issues for us. And we have to ask ourselves as placemakers if we're actually really fit for purpose, if our practice is fit for purpose to serve our communities and places as we encounter these crises, and co-create with them really, real and integrative and innovative solutions to these pressing concerns of our contemporary life. I see placemaking as a community of practice, and this is something which considering placemaking as a community of practice, may be something, or could be something, a vehicle through which we can have that critical lens into what we have done as placemakers, what we're doing now, and what we should be doing in the future, and a way to hold each other to account in that. So I'm a big fan of Etienne Wenger's definition of community of practice, and I offer it here as so you may consider your own relation to placemaking and where we go next with it. So succinctly, as Wenger puts it, community of practice is a group of people who share a common concern or passion for something they do and learn how to do it as they interact regularly. So in that sense, I very much see placemaking as a community of practice. I see these kind of conversations and this knowledge exchange and this generative learning happening all the time. But I think for the good of placemaking's ethical development, we all need to recognise that it is in a complex and contested field, material field, as much as any practice or theoretical or intellectual field. And it's a really negotiated field that we are in as well. And we can see in that field wholly antithetical practices sort of being viewed along a spectrum of practice coming from really different intentional positions, including different definitions of or understandings of what placemaking is to suit that particular project. And I'm guilty of doing exactly the same, of course. And it's it's indicative of what quite a sort of relatively new practice that is. But we are at, I feel, a particular turning point now, and at a time when we do have a critical task ahead of us. That was one of the reasons why I brought together the Handbook of Placemaking, was to be able to reflect on where we've come from, to be able to interrogate what we're doing, and to be able to really push a critical agenda going forward into what we do next. So coming through the 2020 syndemic, and I say syndemic here because, of course, 2020 wasn't just marked with COVID. It was marked by Black Lives Matter, and it was marked by a number of country-specific social concerns that came out of both of those events as well. We've now got really vital new demands of placemaking being made of us, and what I saw through the pandemic was things like this, and it really impressed on me that we are here in the lockdown. I'm obviously speaking from the UK point of view as my own lived experience of it. But never had the window of the domestic space been more permeable to the public realm. And it really reflected on me just that need of connection that we have, and the need we had to be witnessed out in the public realm as well. And what you've got here are some examples from UK and from New Zealand that kind of encapsulate for me what that kind of public realm expression through a lockdown was like. You see here Rachel Summers, a artist ecologist, I believe, in London, who was going around on the daily walk and writing in chalk on the ground what each of those particular trees or shrubs were, and what their uses were, and it really caught people's imaginations. The middle picture is by a Brighton photographer, so somebody local to me. I live in Brighton, and he was taking photographs of people's need for connection through their windows or through their front doors. It's a really, really humorous but very poignant set of images which he's got there. JJ Waller, if you want to look that up. And then, of course, the communications that we were doing through windows, through artwork and through objects. And this is a picture of the teddy bears and windows that was a real phenomenon in New Zealand in lockdown. So for families when they're out on their walks can have got something to look at and go teddy spotting. And I saw so much of this, and of course we were grieving our loss of the public realm, we were grieving our loss of the sociability and the serendipity of the public realm. And it's brought myself and a dear colleague, friend and collaborator, Dr. Anita McEwen, it's brought us to the point of forming something or looking at placemaking through this lens, trauma-informed placemaking. This is being formed into a publication, but also a more expansive research project as well. And it is about understanding that when we go into place as placemakers, there will be trauma. And that, when I was writing, we were putting the handbook together, those last 6 months, we did a radical rewrite of it to include COVID, but also some of the streets that have been written about before were now, in terms of Black Lives Matter movement, particularly in the States, signs of massive protest and police and militia brutality. And those memories are going to stay, and they're going to stay generationally. And so hence coming into placemaking now for us through this trauma-informed lens. And I see a real responsibility for placemakers to understand the trauma of place in the long term, but obviously really acutely post-2020 pandemic. And also what is our role then to look at how we can what is our role in the healing of place as well. We have this obviously from historic place-based trauma. We have it from 2020. We're really going to have it when climate emergency really comes in. It's biting to us now, but trauma place-based, that trauma-informed lens, I think is going to be an absolutely essential understanding and skill for us to have as placemakers going forward. That's all I'm going to say now as part of this presentation. As I said, I didn't directly offer any answers to any questions, but I hope I put enough out there to help us or to provoke us into the conversation going forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kara, for this very dense presentation, but I think it tackled almost all of the aspects that we would like to discuss. I'm actually quite happy that you didn't answer any of my questions, because I think the discussion now hopefully will answer at least some of them, or will approach it from different angles at least. So thank you very much. I'm inviting all the other speakers to turn on their screens now, their cameras. I'm very happy that Stefanie Raab is able to join us. She's an architect, founder, and CEO of Coopolis Planning Office for Cooperative Urban Development. In 2015, she started the first agency for temporary use, in German Zwischennutzungsagentur, in Berlin, Neukölln, with her interdisciplinary.
2005.
Oh, 2005, sorry,
yes.
2005. With her interdisciplinary team, she develops and implements tools for creative support, space activation, vacancy management, and participation. She initiates and gives advice to initiatives, networks, companies, property management, municipalities, owners, and freelancers on project development and funding options of integrated urban development. She's also an expert on the topic of fair, city-compatible tourism. Moreover, she's a lecturer in the field of moderation and participation processes at various educational institutions and universities, and she has lectured nationwide and on a European level. Hi, Stefanie, great that you can be with us. Next up, we have Jakob Blomberg from Helsinki. He's an urban activist, producer, and executive director of Helsinki Urban Art. He specializes in co-creation, placemaking, and urban art. And for the last 10 years, Jaakko has organized many community-based events and projects which introduce new ways of using urban space through art and culture. And these include, for example, and I apologize in advance for butchering most of the Finnish project names, creation of Pasila Street Art District in Helsinki, and developing former industrial areas for cultural use. Thank you for being with us, Jaakko. And last but certainly not least, Søren Gerold is with us from Mannheim. He's CEO and director of the Alte Feuerwache in Mannheim, which is a cultural space here in the city. And he's also the initiator and director of the project Stadt, Kunst, which translates into city wall art, which has brought many big murals to the city, which has received intense media coverage from on the national as well as the international level. And I think I'm very much looking forward to his insights on the project Stadt, Kunst by Sören. Sören, thank you for being with us today. Kara, I wanted to start out with a very basic question that you have hinted at already in your presentation. But I wanted to find out, what are the basic benefits or potentials that you see of using art in public spaces? Why use art and culture for placemaking projects? And what are art and culture able to do that perhaps other spheres cannot do to the extent that art and culture is able to?
There's it's a really good question, and it deserves much more of a sophisticated answer than I'm probably about to give. There's obviously an aesthetic component into arts and culture, and that for many is the default of what they think that role is. But certainly for my own practice, it's that sensibility of the artist, and they have such a broad knowledge when it comes to place-based projects. They are useful through absolutely every stage of the process, to question, to interrogate, to convene people together. I talked there about placemaking and its relationality, and something that I have seen is the skill of an arts-based placemaker is to create a kind of relational object. And I showed a picture there of some people making go-karts on a social housing estate. The making of those go-karts, which is something which came from the history of that estate, became something then that people could talk through. To go up to somebody and say, how do you feel about this place? How do you want it to change? Is it's a big question to people, and you won't necessarily get you might get a bit of a surprise answer coming from them for that. What those kind of processes and an arts-based placemaking can do is to sit with people for a longer time, and they're there engaged in making that go-kart. But what comes out is their experience of that place and their hopes, their aspirations of that place, what they like and don't like about that place. And those are the conversations really that for me are the loci, that's the genesis of a placemaking project. That's where you determine what's going to happen next. So of course, I'm a huge advocate for arts in the public realm, and again, the artists are never brought in early enough onto those projects. I've had to retrofit projects many a time to fit the public art that was then commissioned. But it's the placemaker, the artist, has a role right there from the conception through to the very end delivery and coming back out of that as well to evaluate that place. We've got placemaking projects now that they've been lived in for 10, 15 years. So have they measured up to the what was sort of said of them? And arts has a role to play in all of that. I've worked with some amazing city and rural councils all over the place that really understand the really different value register that an artist can bring to place.
Thank you very much, Kara. Jaco, I was wondering, would you agree that art is sort of like an opener for communication or a platform of exchange of ideas, of engaging in things of mutual interest? What are some of the backgrounds of your projects that you have done in Helsinki? How would you define the role of art in your projects?
Well, of course, it has like a really important aesthetic meaning, but like also, for example, in Pasila, which you mentioned in the beginning, it's like a area built in the 70s. So it was like a lot of concrete, kind of a bit scary place. But at the same time, it was like a perfect place to paint the walls and like make art in that place. And actually, it kind of brought the people also together, because before they were not hanging out on the public space, because like it was kind of, there was nothing to see, there was no reason to be there. It was something just scary. So people kind of started to hang out there, and there were also like some research that it was actually one of the most kind of unsafe felt place before we started this project. But then it kind of now it's like felt like quite safe, like more than usual, or like more than most of the places in Helsinki. So it can actually also create this feeling that it's like a nice place to be, and it's not scary, and because there's basically nothing else happened there. And also it's a good way to bring people together, and like to just like in another place in Kera, we like painted huge walls, and that attracted people, and that kind of people who started to do their own things, and like so it's kind of a good opener for a space to kind of attract their people, and then kind of start to do other things too.
Sören, tell us a little bit about the background of Stadt, Kunst. When did you come up with the idea? What was the intention behind it? How did the project develop over the years? I mean, you've been active for several years now with the project. What first made you go out into the public realm with these big pieces, and what was your initial intention? How did it develop over the years?
Yeah, we actually, in the Alte Feuerwache, in our cultural center, we always had a focus on graffiti and street art, also in our institution. And we were always looking for walls and artists to do something outside in the inner city. So in 2013, we started with a really international, well-known street art duo, Herausforderungen from Germany. They were actually searching for a wall. So we found some good partners, and we managed to do the first wall, and the reactions were so great. So we decided to do more and to really invent like a museum in public space. So right now we have made like over like 35 murals that exist in the inner city. And yeah, there are guided official city tours that are now going on through the city. It's the most booked city tour, and the funny thing is it's mostly booked by Mannheim residents, which is unusual. Normally you don't do a city tour in your own city, maybe. So this made us feel that, okay, people really feel this project, and it's of course, like Jaakko said, it can change the atmosphere in some areas of the city, and of course, in those areas that have a bad reputation, you can put a focus, you can just lead people to go there just to find out about the murals, and then they see, okay, this is actually a nice part of town. There's some old architecture left. I've never been here before, even when I was born and raised in Mannheim. And this is something that we didn't know before, because it was, for us, it was about the art and really about bringing international known street artists to Mannheim. And so accidentally, we kind of came into this placemaking thing. And of course, artists, like mentioned before, artists that work in public space, like street artists, graffiti artists, they know how to, handle people that are on the streets, and they have this, street credibility, and that's what it's all about. And for me, it's a kind of, like calm relationship, because it's not, it's not like loud and it will grab you. You can also walk across a mural, but you can also, talk to the artists, and there is no behind the curtains. Everything is outside, so there's no barrier. There's free access, and people are really, feeling this. I'm talking to this artist right now, so this is something special, and of course, it's really important to taking them serious.
Thank you, Sören. Stephanie, you have been advising various stakeholders when it comes to space activation and creative projects for many years now. What, in your experience, have been some of the biggest obstacles in terms of realizing specific creative placemaking projects that you were involved in or that you advised for? And perhaps how did you overcome these obstacles?
Well, I always ask, how is the deal? So if artists come to me and say, we want to make a project in the public space, I always ask, who is the owner of this space? And what will be the outcome for you if you make an intervention on this space? We already have seen that identity and identification can be pushed a lot by a placemaking project. And also we use placemaking methods to heal. You had, Kara made this wonderful example of the traumatized places. At the moment, we have such a traumatized place, Bad Kleinen in the east of Germany. It is the place where the last terrorists, German terrorists, were catched a few years ago. And this is the only recommendation you have if you say Bad Kleinen. And now we made there an art market with all the public artists, more than 60 public artists, local artists there. And now there is a change of this place, of the meaning of this space. And the locals, they love it very much because the image of their little village changes now, and the local identification is not more this terrorist story, but the story of the art market of Bad Kleinen. We did it the second time this year. So the artists themselves, they are so very emitting social impact. So my role as a creative supporter is always to ask them, what is your deal? So what is your outcome of this? Who is the owner of the space? Who will profit from the win of image space? And how does it pay your cultural and social capital that you invest into this space? And these are very important questions out of the role of a creative supporter to the artists. Because the artists themselves, they are so brilliant that they want to make these placemaking projects. They want to go into the co-creational process with inhabitants and so on and so on and so on. But you, as a curator, you have to save them from their own power, something like that.
Yeah, I think that can be sometimes very important. Thank you, Stephanie. I wanted to tackle the question of participation a little bit, because Kara in the beginning also highlighted for her definition of creative placemaking always involves participation and asking the constituencies and the stakeholders in the neighborhood about their opinions and involving them directly in the process. What do we have to pay particular attention to when starting these processes, especially when it comes to art and the creation of art in the public realm? I guess a question for everybody, but perhaps Jaco, Kara, and Sören could give some insights into how they go about governing these processes of having co-creation in the public realm. Or if that's even the case, sometimes it might not be the case, it might not even be wanted. Who wants to go first? Jaco.
Well, I can start. Yeah. I'm also sometimes asked, or quite often asked, like about some place that what should we do here? And of course, it's a really weird question because I don't know the place. So it's of course you kind of have to start by knowing the place, like knowing the people, what they actually want. And for example, in this Pasila area, it was interesting because there were like people were asking already for since 70s the city to paint the place, but the city never kind of reacted to it. But like we were kind of also figuring out like where art is needed and like where we can do like more participatory stuff, because you kind of have to find also the people and the initiatives, the local groups which already exist, and then start to work with that, like so that you just like don't plan everything at home and then go there, which is usually I think the biggest mistake what you can do. but it's always a bit tricky. Like how can you get people involved? Like how can you find the people? And it always takes some time and research.
Sören, how do you usually go about your projects? Is there an interaction between the artists and the neighborhood and the neighbors, or how does that work? How do you usually go about it?
Yeah, it's different. Sometimes, of course, there's always interaction with artists and people who live in the houses. They get painted, and we search for artists that can deal with the neighborhood. And even if they are international, about all this, Google street view and everything, you can tell them, okay, it's such an area in this neighborhood. There is this institution, that kind of people living there, whatever. And they can still already work before they come on a certain topic. And then you have, of course, you have to know what kind of people live there. Are they into art? Are there, is it more like an academic part or more, like a lot of cultures living in a small house, whatever. And we had some different artists that have like a refugee background, and we put them into a place where they can also interact with people that have had also like a family background that is not from Germany. So there was, of course, interaction. We really try to deal with it. It's not happening all the time. But I think, of course, you can ask people what they want, but also you can trust them to go more in a, like in an abstract way of art. So they, even if they're not usually going to a museum, they know much more about art than they actually know, and this is what we find out when we talk to them on the streets. And we had this one mural with some shapes in the background, and some saw some trees and some saw a mosque, and they can just interpret and just, it inspires them in so many different ways, and you can leave that open. But of course, the communication between artists and people who live in this area is really important.
Kara, what would you say one should pay particular attention to when co-creating art in the public realm? Are there some fundamentals that should always be considered when you do a project like this?
Yeah, and sort of talking about the participation and sort of the recruitment of that. When I've been introduced to a place, it's usually by a kind of self-appointed place gatekeeper. And that might be somebody who sits in a formal role in the council, or it might just be, one of those residents I'm sure we have all met who's just so keen to do everything and has the time, the capacity to do it. And they are fantastic, but they are just the tip of the iceberg. And something which I found when I was working in Dublin, the area that I was working in had kind of changed a little bit, the boundaries of it had changed. And I just started walking around the place with a couple of the key gatekeepers, and the stories that they would have, but also their understanding where the boundaries of it were as well. But of course, in that, we meet people, and there's this kind of domino effect that goes on as well. So I'm always really cautious or work really hard to get to that community of people, that layer of people that's beyond those normal gatekeepers that will always turn up to every meeting. And I'm reminded in this as well, there's a quote in that one of the chapters in the handbook written by Kim Cook. She was talking to Carol Babel, and she's the founder of the Ash Cultural Centre in New Orleans. And Carol says, first you show up. In a while, people will come to know you. Keep showing up, and in a while you will have a community. And so for a lot of the artists that I've worked with, they are in place for a number of years, and they become, and some of the artists I've worked with, they've been called honorary residents because they are there so often. And their knowledge and their then the depth of the conversation they had, as the speakers before us said as well, that community does know a lot. They know what they like when it comes to art. And they're really open to learning more as well. The project in Liverpool, a social practice project, one of the residents just sat back, oh, I get it now. Like, this is the art, this conversation. this baking bread that we're doing in this conversation, that's the art of this, isn't it? So I think also is to never, you know, to never hold an assumption of who the community might be, of what they might be thinking, what they might be interested in. And a question I always ask is, when people are looking and talking about stakeholders, just flip that question around, or flip that positionality around, go, what's at stake if we don't do this? And I think that particularly, Stephanie, to what you were saying as well, those really critical questions that you ask the artists are so important as you know, putting in your foundations of going into place.
I don't know if this is a almost exclusively German debate that also has to do a lot with the German understanding of aesthetics. But if I talk about creative placemaking projects with cultural institutions, such as museums, for instance, they are always highly critical because they find that, you know, oh, you're using art in a functional matter. It's supposed to do a social good. Art should not have any functions. As if, you know, a museum would be a place without any function. But I wonder, have you encountered positions like this? What do you say? And is this a almost exclusively German debate, or have you encountered this in Finland or in the UK as well?
It's not an exclusively German debate, far from it. And yeah, that awful heavy word of instrumentalization comes in. And actually, I want to use the arts to make the world a better place in a really naive utopian way. That's what I want to do. And I think, you know, for me working at Tate, we take that civic mission that we have really, really seriously. And there's a number of projects that we're involved in locally. Actually, I'll search out a little link to a film, because it's a beautiful film of something that we've done with a group that coalesced and called themselves Tate Neighbours. And they hold us to account about our role of being a neighbour there as well. But and I think that's why I went to, or found, Tanya Bagheera's Art Utile thinking so important, because they, you know, art can be there for social good. And that's an absolutely fine thing to say and to do. It doesn't mean you're instrumentalizing it. It doesn't mean you're getting into propaganda. It doesn't take away from the aesthetic. The work that we do has a high aesthetic. In the doing of it, it might look like a complete mess, but it does have a very rigorous aesthetic behind it, and a huge heritage that you can take back to Dadaism, Surrealism, all the rest of it. So you can argue it in those terms very easily, but no, it's not just a German concern.
Jaco, and then Stephanie, please.
Yeah, I think it's quite common, and it's like the museums, they are kind of used it, that they control the public space and the art, and they kind of want to keep their hands tight about like that, like what kind of art people can see, because they're kind of so used to it. And I think it's not just about museums, but also like this kind of cultural elite, I would call them, like who kind of don't want to see anything kind of too easy or too like something that people actually like, most of the people like, but they want to see just abstract art or black and white, or like something like they're kind of like, one person said that she doesn't want to see street art, because if she wants to enjoy culture, she will go to opera. And I think this kind of explains quite well the difference between people. Like, there are this kind of like culture elite who doesn't want to see any art unless they kind of go to see it. And then there are like these common people who kind of enjoy it a lot.
Stephanie, please.
So I'm from the practical side, and I'm really no art historist, but you have a 7,000 Oaks project by Joseph Beuys, one of the most famous placemaking projects ever, and it is German, and it is in the German art history well known. So I don't know why they argue like this. I think Jaco is right with this elitaire discussion that you have already, but you had it over the years and over the hundreds of years. You always had this struggle in the art discussion. May art be participative? May art be public? or is it only for the elites? And this discussion you have also in the placemaking context. And in the whole placemaking context, you have the wide range of instrumentalization of artists for upgrading public space until really, really good projects in the interest of the neighborhoods. You have always these very wide ranges of reinterpretation of artistic projects.
I was wondering, Kara hinted at that as well. Do the aesthetics of art in the public realm, or if art is co-created, necessarily change? Is the aesthetic experience necessarily different? And if yes, how so? Could we describe the aesthetic element a little bit further, or what you are, if you're curating or co-curating a creative placemaking project, what do you pay attention to with regard to the aesthetic experiences that you would like to make possible or afford in these projects? Is this something that, perhaps if I phrase the question differently, would the artworks also work in a closed space? Or is this something that is particular to the public realm, to the public space?
I think it's a good question. Of course, like if you are kind of co-curating it with people, it's different. Like and like if you ask people what they want to see, it's usually always the same stuff. It's like nature and so on. Like really kind of actually what they're asking for, and also they're usually asking for something what already exists. So kind of the task is kind of to try to make things think outside the box, kind of not just like think about what already exists, but what could exist. And this is kind of one big question, and also like kind of to keep it participatory, but at the same time like keep the quality high. So how can you kind of involve people, but like still make art that is like really nice in an aesthetic way. And also it depends like how it is created. Like for example, if we do something with the school and children, then it's of course totally different than if it's like just done by the artist or done with adults or so on, or with a longer time. So I think there are kind of a lot of different levels, and you kind of have to take this into account, like how to make the best outcome with this kind of framework that you have at that point.
So I want to add something here. Yeah, Søren.
Yeah, really, for me, it's the same thing. So if we let people just request things that they want, where we would have a lot of dolphins and I don't know, jungle motives, whatever. And like I said earlier, just trust them, because we had also like a surrealistic art piece in front of the red light district in Mannheim, and it worked perfectly. So people were so excited about it, and it's just yeah, quality is a big thing. So everybody will recognize quality as well, different styles, even abstract, even these murals that could fit into like a museum or gallery can work outside. And it's the same thing. You just don't have to pay entrance fee. It's right in front of your eyes. It's just, there's no barrier there. It's nothing, there we still get to know so many people that are afraid to go to a museum because they think I don't know anything about art, or to go to a gallery because they think if I go there, I have to buy something, and this is something you don't have in public space. And that's the best thing. We always see people discussing in front of art pieces and, also arguing, and some don't like the art. And so there is something moving, and they of course think about public space as well. So if some people come and say, I really don't like this kind of art, why is it there? Why didn't you do the dolphin? We have discussions about advertisements, because nobody's arguing about that. Advertisements, okay, they have to be there. Art is something you can really discuss about, and And that's the main thing. It's a process, like Kara said before.
Stephanie, and then Kara, please.
When I was teaching young Kunstarbeiter, art workers, we had 3 aspects how to conceptualize placemaking projects. And one was readability. So try that this piece of art can be readable by the surrounding people. Then size matters. So look, how big is the space? And in relation to that, how big must be your intervention that it can be readable? Because if you have 2 small letters, it can be readable. This is a very architectural also approach, but it is not that unimportant. And accessibility. So be open to the discussion. So make something that the neighbors really can participate. That's that you also say them you wish the communication with them, something like that, that you don't seem to be too uncommunicative or too artisty or something like that. So these are three very important qualitative aspects for a placemaking project.
Thank you, Kara.
I agree with all of what everybody said on this, and I think it's a real sort of soapbox issue for me, in that sort of work that's done, artwork that's done with community or in place is always seen as this poor relation to, you know, fine art and the art that you would see in a white-walled gallery space. And I have seen work from place go into the gallery space, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. That work that's been created outside is site-specific, so maybe it won't translate over. But it does frustrate me when that kind of critique comes from people that really don't understand the aesthetic that goes through the process, that don't understand that rigor. I don't have a fine art background, so I wouldn't go in and decide to curate a particular show in a gallery or museum in a particular way. I have lots of opinions on that, but it's not my skill set. And so it's that kind of encroachment by certain discourses into this, I think, are really, they frustrate the process. That's just my particular bugbear.
I was wondering, since we have people from cultural institutions here as well, when it comes to creative placemaking projects, can an institution like Tate be actually a hindrance or an obstacle because people feel intimidated maybe by the big name? And how do you go about approaching people despite that fact? It might be similar with different projects from Helsinki or Sören. Perhaps you could also share some insights here. But I was wondering, what is the role of cultural institution when it comes to creative placemaking projects? And what do cultural institutions, if they do engage in creative placemaking, what should they pay attention to when approaching different stakeholders?
Feel free to mute me if I go on too much about this, because I can talk about this particular subject all day. There are 4 Tate sites across the UK, 2 of them in London, 1 in Liverpool, 1 in St Ives. The Liverpool and St Ives ones are both in areas of quite severe economic deprivation, where there is a really unequal access to culture. The role that they play at a regional level in regional development is huge, absolutely huge. I work across all of those sites, but my office is at Tate Modern. When Tate Modern was built, this was late 90s, it was opened in 2000, there was nothing in that area of London. And it was a really, really dangerous area to go to. And even when the Tate had opened, to actually get on the tube and come out at the Southwark stop for it, it didn't feel safe. Certainly for myself walking, if I was on my own, it just wouldn't feel safe. I wouldn't go there at night. Now, it is one of the busiest areas in London. And I don't think it would be a surprise to anybody to say that Tate Modern being there was a massive driver in that regeneration. there have been some upticks, there's been some good things to that. Residents have commented on that it does feel safe, that they are on the transit map now like they were before, and that kind of thing. But it's also an area of just massive glass offices and flats that are barely resident. So is that good? You know, there's the debate in that is a really, really rich one. Certainly for our audience profile, and in a way, the conversation of this being from a tape position might be a hindrance, because we have so many different departments that do so many different things. Think of any function in a museum and we have a department for it. But in general terms, our audience was 50% international, and then the rest came from London and the rest of the UK. They did not come from who was on our doorstep, and that was a real problem. And that's something that Tanya Bagheera, when we were working with her, really looked at and wanted to address. And those neighbours really held us to account. It's like, you are not being a good neighbour to us. We do not come to you because you do not look welcoming. You look like the global, art brand experience that excludes us. And we've been working with this group for a long time. We're kind of in a post Tanya Bagheera world now, and it has really flipped how the responsibilities that Tate as an institution feels to its neighbours. And then the area that I run, Tate Exchange, is exactly that space for voices external to the museum to come in and be really loud and to be heard by the public and by the institution. It's a constant challenge.
Thank you, Cara. Any thoughts from Mannheim or Helsinki on this matter?
Yeah, I think it's not about doing something kind of placemaking in public space and just brand it as Alte Feuerwache, as we don't do, because it's just about the impact that it has, and not about okay, this is all Alte Feuerwache project. So, and we do a lot of other things as well. We do workshops in schools and kindergartens. We bring Bulgarian break dancers to the playgrounds to collect people and do workshops with them. So we are all there. It's a lot of other things that we're doing, and also concerts in public space all the time. So yeah, I think it can be both. It's so, I mean, if it comes to really big institutions, it can be worse to because people think, okay, it's again this elite program or something, it's not for me. But I think if you work constantly, it will disappear. Maybe it always depends how, if you are on one line with the people who work in the area or in the neighborhood. If you come from up there and you tell them to go there, do this, whatever, it will not work. You have to be with them. It's not you can't be there as an alien. You must be with the people. That's the main thing.
Stephanie.
So now, I think this is the responsibility of the institutions as well. We discussed it just in Stralsund with the new cultural concept that is nowadays, because the people don't visit the arts or the museums if they are not in a very high level education sector of the society. So the art or the institutions have to go to the people, so they have to go outside, and placemaking is a very good method to bring the art to the people in the areas where not so privileged people are living. And so this is more a technique, or a cultural technique, that has to be in the range of techniques to communicate about the arts for every institution, something like that. This is the vision we developed in, so say, it is the sort of responsibility for all publicly financed institutions to bring with placemaking methods. You can transport the cultural subjects outside of the institution buildings.
Yeah, Kara.
I just wanted to say something which is, I'm not, Stephanie, I'm not disagreeing with you at all, and so please don't take this as what I'm about to say as a criticism, but a concern that we have at Tate is with all of our work around decolonisation that we're doing, that model of outreach is one that we're looking at, as in, what if, you know, is this a paternalistic model? You know, is it that if we just take the art to people, then they'll love it and that'll be all great? It isn't that at all, and it is quite a colonial model. But actually, that's it. I mean, obviously, it's important that we interrogate that, but that is pushing our practice and pushing our understanding and the conversations we're having with people in really quite radical ways. And you know, we're not there yet. And you know, for an institution like Tate, the decolonisation is going to be a long, long process. But you know, it's just been good for us to have a little bit of a sense check around, okay, when we go out, why, how, what, where, all of those questions we are putting through a really strong interrogative critical lens.
Thank you. I wanted to touch upon one other aspect that all of you have hinted at already, and Sören just mentioned it. It's all about the impact. But how do we go about measuring the impact? I'm frequently asked this about creative placemaking projects. So, okay, this is nice and this looks good and it's all fine, but you know, what is the impact that you're having on this place? Is there something, are there any numbers that you can generate? I was wondering if we could go into the evaluation of creative placemaking projects, both quantitative and qualitative aspects. Kara, what are some of the aspects that one could mention here, and then we'll do the round?
Yeah, that's a really big question, and in the handbook it became such a big question. It has its own section on it. I see, in very, very blunt terms, there's a lot of metric analysis of creative placemaking in the States, looking at job creation, job retention, house prices, those kind of indices of success. That might be great, and I'm not going to deny a place having economic success, absolutely not. But my interest is more in the qualitative, the responses to place that people have in that embodied and emotional way, their feelings of safety, their feelings of pride in their place. And so when I go in as a researcher, it's those kind of questions that I have of myself and will have of other people as well. One of the real drawbacks to that, though, is that, you know, some of those metrics you can measure within 6 months. The more qualitative evaluation of a place, you know, ideally, I'd go back 5, 10, 15 years later. There is no funding to do that. And so that kind of, I think the real scope that we get to the qualitative research or the qualitative evaluation is somewhat hampered by the funding processes that are the usual ones for funding such projects. But I think, as I said earlier, we've got a number of projects now that have been in place for a number of years. I think it'd be a really valid thing to go back and go, okay, how does this measure up? What is it like to live here now? Is it any better? You know, there's a huge, and again, that might generate completely new metrics for us to be considering place by.
Kara, you mentioned like the usual economic development metrics and the indicators that come along with that. But what are some of the softer qualitative aspects? What are some of the metrics there, and how do you go about finding these metrics? And are they interviews? Do you interview people over a longer period of time? What's the process like?
Yeah, so. You know, those, I'm not a quantitative researcher. It's not that I'm not interested in it, it's just, well, maybe it is. but for me it is around, you know, that hackneyed phrase, but that sense of place. It's said almost like a throwaway thing, and in a way to devalue placemaking, that you know, people have met their neighbours for the first time by being involved in the project, and it's like, actually, hold on a minute, that's really significant, that's really meaningful, that to me is a really, really valid outcome, and if I can be part of that process, then fantastic, absolutely fantastic. Some of the outcomes that I've seen have been around, you know, groups becoming self-organising and taking on a particular issue of place to campaign to bring about a policy change. There's a lot that have taken over, areas of land themselves, turned it into whatever it is that, you know, that community particularly wants. So I see, you know, the things that I look at is around place identity, place stewardship, that's, you know, the cultural capital that can come out of those kind of projects. Some of that I can observe in my role, you know, my trained role as a researcher, as a participant observer. And of course, I bring with that, though, my own practice and seeing it happen in all sorts of different ways, and bring that into the equation as well. It is through a lot of observation, and it is through a lot of myself being hands-on in those projects, being that participant. And it is through a lot of interviews. And, you know, there's all sorts of different ways to hold those interviews, but in a sense, the longer I'm there, the deeper those conversations come. And as we've said earlier before, or where you were saying something about, you know, they'll want the dolphins, I absolutely know that, but sit with them another 5 conversations, you're in a completely different area. And it's exactly the same when you go back to evaluate. You know, be like, oh yeah, no, it looks really nice. That's great. That is great. Brilliant. I'm glad your street looks nice. But a deeper conversation is like, actually, I feel really safe coming home now. Or, you know, I've showed off that mural to friends of mine that have come to visit, and on we go. You know, that's the kind of realm that I'm in. It does take time and it does take work, and we don't always have the capacity financially or otherwise to do that.
Søren, Jaco, from your experiences, have you been asked to evaluate your projects in a quantitative manner? And is it even fair to evaluate art in a quantitative manner?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a tricky question, especially like if you are like not an institution or you don't have a big funding, because often we think like it would have been so great to make some research about this, but like usually there is no resources for that. And like often also when you start something, you kind of don't know like how it will go, how much it will, or like what will happen in the future. So you kind of just start to do things, and then something more happens, and then in the end you think like, whoa, it would have been so great to make some research about this, because of course you can always do it afterwards, but it should be like a constant process. But yeah, it's a tricky question, and like everything that was said before, like, yeah, I agree with that. And but like there are like some hints, like I just mentioned about this safety thing, that how the area is now felt much more safer than it was before, and this kind of stuff. But like it's quite tricky to measure these things and to have resources to do the research. I mean, because usually you have quite limited resources and you are just focusing on doing and not like researching. But it would be great to have more research about it, because this is how you also can prove that that this thing really works and it's worth of it.
Kara.
Something I forgot to say actually is Art Place America did a whole load of field scan studies that were really useful, looking at placemaking and intersection with education, transit, healthcare, and they are a really interesting read and a really good model of how to consider the outcomes and outputs of placemaking, not just necessarily, you know, thinking about a sort of a broader frame of evaluation. And Policy Link in the States as well have published a theory of change for placemaking. And that does lean, you know, towards that qualitative side too. But again, it does also speak to a longitudinal approach. But I should signpost those as two really good resources to consider evaluating projects.
Thank you very much, Kara, for this, and also for posting some of the useful links here in the chat. I would like to encourage all viewers, if you have a question, post it in the Q&A or in the chat directly, and I'll post the question in our discussion. Please feel free to do that. There's one big elephant left in the room that we haven't touched upon yet, and that is the whole topic of gentrification. Stephanie, I would like to give you that question first, since I think it's a very hot topic in Berlin right now. It's increasingly also here in Mannheim. We're having several discussions that directly associate placemaking efforts with gentrification. I was wondering, how do you perceive the relationship between creative placemaking projects and gentrification from your experience?
Well, I think there is an interaction. If you see the area where I have worked since 2005 now, and you see the ground prices there and the rents for housing there, and so the long-term impact on placemaking projects should always be in a very good in mind. And this is also the reason why we will make, with a very young group of placemakers from tomorrow on, first de-gentrification seminar in Berlin, because we have really the problem that the people, they start their projects in a sort of naive way, and they are not so conscious that they are really do such upgrading impact on the spaces themselves. And so it is very important you make them conscious for this impact, this way of impact for their engagement, and because then they can also approach on the questions to who belongs the city, and then placemaking could be also a very good impact giver if you ask the questions, to whom does the ground belong? And so I hope we will make it better than in the first generation of placemakers to that I belong with my now 50 years. And I hope we can really transfer to the next generation of placemakers also these impacts that we didn't have in mind in that 20 years ago, in that important task today.
I think the issue is very tricky and very complex. There are no easy answers to this relationship. And I just wanted to quote something that I found, Kara, in your edited book on placemaking by Stephen Pritchard, who is very critical of creative placemaking project. And he says, creative placemaking uses art to window dress neoliberal regeneration and renewal agencies. So there he poses a direct relationship between arts and creativity in the public realm and gentrification processes. Is there a way, in your opinion, to counteract that? How can I sort of govern the effects that my art might have in the public realm? Is this something more about the process of creating this art, or can I somehow gear the effects and the experience of art in a certain direction? But that seems very difficult to do for me. But Kara, please give us some insights here.
Stephen's absolutely right to make that, and but I don't think that all placemaking does do that. There's a very, overground macro developer-led kind of normative placemaking that absolutely is totally culpable for mass social cleansing and gentrification. But you're right when you say it is a complex issue. When I was working in Indianapolis, I was working in an area there that was beginning to feel those effects of gentrification. One of the residents said, well, look, for the first time now, I can get a really good cup of coffee on my doorstep. And who am I to deny the person the right to get a good cup of coffee on their doorstep? Does that person still live there now, though? 10 years later, whatever it is, I don't know. I can see that probably they may well have been really priced out of that area. And you know, London is a constant site of social cleansing now, which is horrific to look at, absolutely horrific. For me, it is absolutely about the practices that you have, and you can't necessarily, as Jacqueline said, you can't sort of future engineer the outcomes of something. They will be what they will be as you go along. But I think to step back even before the processes, I have a set of values that I work to continuously, and there will be a line there that on some project I feel, okay, I'm being compromised now, or I might be compromised. I've worked with some amazing developers. Not all of them are, you know, the bad guy in the room here. But it is, for me, it comes from their intentionality. I've worked with developers that their intentionality, their understanding of their role, is of somebody that's creating homes, that's creating a community. You know, this is sort of working from a brownfield site to completely new thing like that. They are creating a community that people are going to live in, and those families for generations. And they've taken that responsibility really, really seriously. Others, I've seen, you know, well, we all know what it looks like. Room sizes that are tiny, and they are just selling units. So for me, it's the intentionality. And for me, that intentionality and my values is something that's live for me before I start a project and as I go through a project as well. I can't say I always get it right, but it is my job to hold myself accountable to those values.
Sören, Jaco, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about, do you think about the effects that the art that you curate, that you bring into public space contributes to gentrification processes? And is that something that you're trying to counteract? And how does that figure in the conceptualization of your projects?
Well, of course, I'm also always thinking about it, but so far I don't think we have had this problem because, for example, Pasila, it's mostly like social housing, so it's kind of yeah, it's not that much in danger of gentrification in that sense. Also, I've been working mostly like with areas that are like still kind of not the hottest ones, so to say, more like in a more distant suburbs or areas that are, or cities that are kind of like shrinking actually. So it's so far it hasn't been that big problem, but like of course it's like something to keep in mind all the time, and like think about like to whom you are doing this art and like what influences it will have in the future.
Sören, any thoughts on this, also with perhaps the particular context of Mannheim?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's the same. Like the most of the houses we use are social houses that belong to a local housing association. And also, if we have private owners of houses, we talk to them before, and normally they get the topic. And we are really privileged that we have some fundings, so that we are not. Yeah, we don't have to work with real estate agents that will resell urbanity to their to the people who live in their houses. So, but you never know how it develops. So it's really a complicated question for me. So we didn't have this problem so far. But yeah, I mean, it's always a big thing. There are some areas that need some changes, but if you start changing something, and then you have, of course, the topic of gentrification as well. So it's it's a hard topic, and we also know about it, and we take care. But you never know how the house owner will act in 10 years, when the whole part of town has developed in a different direction.
Stephanie.
I wanted to add also the other perspective, and this is the perspective of the long-term inhabitants of Berlin-Neukölln. So we, 15 years ago, we didn't believe in gentrification, but now agency for temporary use. And I think they are not totally wrong. But on the other hand, the long-term inhabitants of Neukölln, they also say that it is much more attractive today to live there, and it is also much more safe to live there. And so the long-term inhabitants also say it has objectively become more attractive to live in Neukölln, and they say it's also very positive. So it has the two aspects. And gentrification is also a problem of renting law and things like that. So don't make the artists guilty for something they can't be guilty for.
Yeah, that's what I was going to add. I feel like that artists and creatives are the easy scapegoats sometimes for gentrification processes, and people are very quick to point at artists.
Yeah.
But I feel like, you know, as you said, zoning laws, rent laws, how many apartments are created in the city, what are social housing schemes, etc. All of this, I think, figures into gentrification processes. But that's usually not discussed as widely as why, you know, hipsters or artists, etc., gentrifying an area. That seems to be more than a symbol than the actual driver of this process in the larger scheme of things. With regard to time, I think we have time for one more question. And before I do move on to the last subject, I wanted to ask a question here from, I guess, the audience. Do you think is it possible with creative placemaking projects to conserve a community or to keep the community stable? I think Stephen Pritchard also talks about, I think it's called place guarding. So can artists function as keepers of a community and a place, and what has to be in place in order to ensure that this is actually happening? Stephanie.
I could answer from the Neukölln experience, and in this way, it is really like that the artists that we worked with in the last 15 years, they stayed in Neukölln because the place was made by them. And many of them wanted to move at the beginning of the process, and now they stay there. And they give also, and their families give also, a stabilizing aspect to, for instance, the local schools, because their children go to the local schools as well, and they mix up the people at schools and things like that. So it has this aspect as well.
Kara, any thoughts on how we can keep existing communities?
Statistically, you could also say, yes.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
You had
there's a time lag.
Yeah.
Okay.
You want to finish your thought?
Oh, yes, I want to finish. I don't know the English word. If the people move from a place away, so statistically, the mobility in Neukölln has declined. So today, the neighborhoods are much more stable than 15 years ago when we started with this regeneration process. And this is an aspect of stabilization of a society, a neighborhood. But you can also discuss, they don't move out because the rents are too high and they don't find other places today. So you can discuss it from both sides. But the neighborhoods are more stable like 15 years ago. It's statistically proved.
I agree with that. I've got to say that, hands up. I'm really sorry. I lived in Neukölln for a while, so I was definitely part of the problem. a lovely place it is. I struggle with the idea of keeping a place. Places change all the time, so they should. It's who's doing it and how it's done. That's the problem for me. And the link I've put into the chat there is a project that I always mention because it's still for me a really good example of artists taking those means of capital development into their own hands and keeping the place, but also changing that place. But it's from the grassroots. Big Car is an organisation that works in Indianapolis. They brought up a number of houses around where their new base was. They're turning those into artist homes, peppercorn rent, first option to buy. As Jim, one of the founders of Big Car, said, we can see the gentrification coming towards us. We've got to be in charge of it, and this was their response, their own particular response to doing that. And yeah, let's face it, artists sort of always move somewhere because it's cheap, not because they want to gentrify it, because they need somewhere that's cheap to live and that has space. But just as you say as well, Stephanie, the examples that I see is artists stay, and their kids are brought up there. And so on, yeah.
Let's take one last look into the future of placemaking, which Kara has already done in her presentation as well. And I think it was very useful because I found it interesting to think about the function and the role of public space in general that definitely changed during the pandemic. And I was wondering if you find that the public space is going to have a completely new role in the future because what we have gone through the pandemic, that people had to gravitate towards public space in order to meet, in order to communicate, in order to exchange. Do you think that is going to stay that way? And what could be the role of creative placemakers in this regard?
Yeah, I think this is something good that came out from pandemic. So it's like more like thinking about public space and how we use it and for whom we make it and so on. So I think this now people kind of understand also much more like what kind of public spaces we need and like how people use them and so on. So I think for placemaking and in general for using of public space, it's I think this will stay and we will see more and more thinking and using of the space.
Any other thoughts on this? So, yes.
Yeah, for us, it was also really interesting to see within the lockdown over social media, we saw that like people and families organized their own city tours by bike, or they just walked around the whole city, tagging us with all the murals, and a lot of like sentences like it's the only way to consume art in any kind right now because all the institutions are closed. And this is, of course, it will remain, I think. And also, yeah, I think it's whether in London or Helsinki, when all the clubs and concert houses were closed, you saw young people outside with this Bluetooth speakers and loud music and whatever, some beer. They did their own clubbing. And it will remain. And of course, it could be a challenge to find places for them to have their own club, and without disturbing other people live there, residents. And yeah, but I hope that some things will stay because this was for us as a concert house. We do usually 300 concerts a year. We did nothing, and so Stadt Kunst was the only thing to communicate with people. And I hope that things like this will remain in the future as well.
All right. I think it's going to be very interesting to observe how the public realm is going to change, what free spaces we're able to preserve or to generate for the people of the city and the stakeholders. But I think creative placemaking, I think, and the role and the importance of creative placemaking is going to increase in the future. I'm pretty sure of that, because there's a need for bringing different stakeholders together to think collectively about how we want to use our public space, what do we want to do there, how can it be more open, more inclusive, and ultimately more sustainable than it is in a lot of ways today. So I think the importance and the role of creative placemaking is definitely going to increase in the future, and we need more inputs, more discourse, and more projects in the urban realm and the public realm in order to facilitate some of the processes that we're looking for in this regard. I want to thank all of you from the bottom of my heart for this great discussion. Kara, Stephanie, Sören, Jaco, thank you so much for being with us for the second edition of the International Placemaking Forum Mannheim, which is part of InnoMake Festival. And we're going to have 2 more panels, one on community building and placemaking, and another one on sustainability issues and sustainable impact of placemaking. So make sure to join them as well if you're interested. And yeah, that's a wrap. Thank you very much. Take care and stay in touch.